Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, the Lion King's Shenzi and Mzingo, setting the record straight. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, Lorraine.
Hi, Rob. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, I'm really excited to be doing a presentation right at the top of the new year. So yeah, I think it's going to be a great 2022 for all of us involved in natural habitat adventures. So the topic I've chosen today may seem a little strange to some people, and I don't expect everybody at the end of it to be thinking as I do particularly about hyenas, because I have a very, very soft spot for hyenas. But what I would like to do is, I think it started pre the Lion King, but I think the Lion King perpetuated it because it needed goodies and baddies. And essentially what happened was, I think hyenas and vultures kind of got the short end of the straw, and they landed up as the baddies. And a lot of what was portrayed in terms of their behavior and their abilities, I felt it was a pretty raw deal for them. So that's why we've called it Setting the Record Straight, just to show them in another light, and perhaps to just get people look at them a little bit better. So that's kind of how we've got onto the topic of hyenas and vultures as two groups. So that's just a picture of me. I'm afraid at the moment we still don't have enough bandwidth where I'm based, but we're hoping that coming soon we'll be able to utilize the webcam. So I thought I would just start with a general introduction of hyenas. And interestingly, you'll notice that there's two different spellings on this slide. One has got an AE and one has just got an E. It's basically the British English and the American English spellings. So exactly the same animal, just a slightly different spelling of it. And worldwide, there are only 4 extant species of hyenas. So by extant, I mean ones that are still living. So there were at one point in history, millennia ago, many more. But these are basically the remaining, or the remnants, if you will, of the family. So these creatures fall into the family Hyenidae. So any word that you see in a book that ends IDEA, denotes a family level. So like your domestic cat is part of the family Felidae, your domestic dog is part of the family Canidae. And so hyenas are so unique that they actually have their own family. And these are the 4 members of that family. So just quickly, the striped hyena is really part of the arid areas of North Africa. So not something that I have ever seen. Yeah, I think is pretty rare to see actually in the wild. The brown hyena is the classic one that many people who have been to Namibia on the southwest coast of Africa, it's called a strandloper there, which basically means a beach wanderer. And it's because it will actually find food on the beaches. It scavenges very efficiently on beaches. We do also have them here in South Africa. I have seen them, but they're quite timid animals. Then the spotted hyena. The spotted hyena is still the most widely distributed, found through most of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in savanna and in some forest habitats. So it's able to survive in quite a vast variety of different environments. And then the last one is highly, highly specialized, the aardwolf. Also possible to see in southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and those places. And it also goes up into a little bit of East Africa, the very eastern portions, right up into Eritrea and Somalia. So when I say highly specialized, although it's still part of this family, because it does have some characteristics in its genetics that make it part of the family, but it has become so highly specialized that all it eats is ants. That's all it eats, nothing else. And its teeth have been reduced to little peg-like structures. And yeah, it runs literally around licking up ants, and that's what sustains it. So these are just more realistic pictures of them, just to give you an idea of what they look like. You can see that ones like your brown hyena's got this very long, shaggy coat, as has the striped hyena. The aardwolf is many orders of magnitude smaller than the others. And then the one in the top left-hand corner is the one that we're really going to focus on during the course of this evening, because that's the one that the hyenas in The Lion King were modeled on. So I think for many people, it's highly likely they didn't even know there were another 3 species, because the spotted hyena is certainly the one that people would be most familiar with. So this is a picture of an adult female spotted hyena. Scientific name Crocutta crocutta. And basically crocutta comes from Latinized Greek, meaning golden jackal. And it's interesting because in many bodies of literature, particularly older literature, they were referred to as jackals, and they have no relationship with jackals whatsoever. Jackals actually fall into the dog family, and they bear no resemblance or even history in terms of their genetics and their evolution. They don't bear any resemblance to jackals. But needless to say, the name still stuck, and so the spotted hyena is Crocutta crocutta. So this is just a very brief family tree, if you like. And the only thing I really want you to focus on or draw your attention to is, so we're looking here, and I'm hoping my arrow can be seen, at a common ancestor about 53 million years ago, which then diverged into a lineage which ultimately gave us dogs, and interestingly also pandas. So pandas are a very unique anomaly. People call them panda bears. They are in no way related to any other bear on Earth. But that's kind of an aside portion. What's interesting is when people look at particularly spotted hyenas, they think, related to dogs. But if you look at this divergence here, they're actually much more closely related to cats than they are to dogs. So we think that their common ancestor was probably something a little bit like something we call a civet, a little black and white animal. And that broke off, the hyena line of Crocutta crocutta broke off quite early. But from that same ancestor, you got the development of your domestic cats, and then also all of your large cats, so your leopards, your lions, your tigers. So it's one of the interesting things that I find about hyenas is that although they fill the niche, if you will, of a dog, they're much more closely related to cats. And some of their behavior, when you watch them quite closely, you'll see that some of their behavior in terms of the way they groom themselves and so on is actually quite similar to cats. So when people tell me that hyenas are very, very ugly creatures, I always think of when they're tiny little chaps and they look like little black teddy bears. So this particular slide, I was very fortunate enough to spend quite a lot of time on the reserve where I'm based, watching a hyena den. And this picture was taken, the den actually was unfortunately raided by lions, and some of the cubs were killed. And as a result of that, the hyenas abandoned the den. But for the better part of close on a year, I managed to observe the life of these hyenas in this den. And this picture was taken on the day when this mom hyena first brought the little baby from the den where she had given birth to it into the communal den where the other young cubs were located. And as you can see, doing exactly what all dogs and cats will do, picking the cub up by the scruff of its neck to move it around. What's interesting about these little chaps as well is that they are born with their eyes open and their teeth erupted. Their eyesight is very, very poor, but their eyes are open nonetheless, and they have teeth. And so I think mom hyenas suckling them have a bit of a challenge because from day one, they've got teeth. They also have these almost what look like disproportionately large feet. And as you can see, they are pitch black in color. So they, to my mind, they actually look like little bears. So this particular litter, there were two. Hyena females generally will give birth to relatively small litters, between maybe 2 or 3. So not the same as your dogs and cats who will give birth to, really big litters. And I'll explain a little bit later why that is. But as you can see, these little two little cute chaps were suckling on mom. So what's interesting about hyenas is they have incredibly rich, nutritious milk. And only the milk of polar bears and sea otters has actually got a greater fat content. Their milk is also extremely high in vitamins and minerals, especially things like calcium. And so hyena moms will suckle their young for as much as 2 years. So definitely for between 9 months to a year, but as much as 18 to 24 months. That's extraordinary amongst carnivores. Most carnivores will suckle their young for approximately 3 months. And then they're on to solid food immediately, and because it's obviously very energy intensive to produce milk, and so for most predators that have to hunt, they just can't sustain it for long periods. So hyenas can start eating meat, and they will eat meat from about 8 months, but they will still continue to have their diet supplemented by milk from mum. And one of the theories about their ability to lactate for so long and produce nutrient-rich milk is because they're pretty much the only predator or carnivore that can digest bone. So they can take pieces of bone and they will essentially digest it within a matter of hours. They can even digest teeth. Takes them a little bit longer to digest the teeth of something, but their jaws, which are so incredibly powerful, will crush bone, powder it pretty much, and they can then digest it. And so the theory is that because of that behavior, they're able to provide milk for these youngsters for a far longer period of time. Unlike lions and things like wild dogs, for example, hyena mums do not suckle one another's cubs. So everything in a hyena society is about competition. And it's a very, very strongly matriarchal society. So the females are substantially bigger than the males. They can weigh as much as 8 or 9 kilograms more than the male. And they have extremely high levels of testosterone, which gives them high aggression levels in terms of maintaining clan structure. And so they rule the roost. So as you can see here, in comparison to the little kind of black bundle of the previous slide, this is clearly a much older cub, and yet this cub is still very clearly being suckled by mom. So mom may have more than one litter of different ages that she is suckling at any given time as well. So that's another part of their society or life, if you will, that's not common amongst other predators. So hyenas are innately curious. They, of all the youngsters that I've ever watched, lion cubs, leopard cubs, wild dogs, hyenas, these guys are incredibly inquisitive. They will walk up to vehicles. I've had them standing next to the vehicle, looking at the tires, sniffing underneath the bumper of the vehicle. So yeah, just generally wanting to see what's going on. And so they're also very inquisitive about their siblings that have just been introduced to them. Sorry, having a problem with my door. So they're very curious about their siblings. And as you can see, this little one is, it's not at this point showing any sign of aggression towards its sibling, but that is not always the case. There is a lot of rivalry between siblings in a fight for dominance, if you will, because the higher ranking you are in hyena society, the better your chances of survival. And so a lot of that is played out through a level of aggressive behavior. So this is just to show you kind of the life, some of the changes, if you like, in terms of what they look like. So this is basically pretty much a fairly newborn hyena, enormous ears, pitch black, looks like a little teddy bear. Then they start from about the age of 2 months. They start to get lighter from the head downwards. And so the blackness, you can still see in the back of this one's legs. That black only really disappears when they're kind of 18 months of age. So this progressive darkening from the front moving backwards. And then as they come into 2-3 years of age, they reach sexual maturity at about 3. By that stage, they've now taken on the hue pretty much of the adult. So they get this much more, in a way, grizzled, I suppose, look to them, but they also have that more, there's a little bit more of a golden sheen on them. And so that's pretty much how they change through their life. So one of the most incredible things about hyenas is their social interactions. And a lot of it is linked into their unique way of life in terms of being a strongly matriarchal society. The only other really strongly matriarchal society amongst African animals is with your African elephants. But what is different about this interaction is that the females here are the absolute top dog or top hyena, to put it more correctly. So much so that a very young female hyena cub, especially one born to the dominant female in the clan, is higher ranking and therefore afforded more privileges than even an adult male. So you kind of don't want to be a male hyena because they do have it a little bit rough. And so what happens in terms of greetings, they have these very specialized greeting rituals. And part of one of those rituals is starting to be demonstrated here. So most animals, I'm sure if you've seen lions and to an extent leopards, when they greet, if they're greeting one another, or cubs, they'll kind of rub muzzles, necks, maybe groom each other a little bit. Essentially what hyenas do is they do a little bit of face-to-face contact, and then what they do is they turn nose to tail like this and expose their genitalia. So basically expose the most vulnerable part of themselves, and that's their way of kind of introducing themselves to each other, that I'm not at this point in time going to no threat to you. And so this is our form of social greeting. Obviously, you wouldn't have had a situation that would have developed like this if there was any level of conflict, but it is a very unusual way of greeting, and it's pretty much, it's very, as far as I know, certainly in African animals, there's nowhere else that really do it to this kind of extent, both males and females. And yeah, quite a unique situation. So this poor chap, I watched this male hyena many times, and at this point I think he'd just kind of given up a little bit, kind of resigned himself to the fact that maybe he wasn't going to get any food on this day, because every time he came near to where the food was, he'd get chased away. And they do this very strange chittering type of behavior. It almost sounds like a little bit of a strange giggle, which is a subservience gesture to say, I just want to take a little bit, please won't you let me have some? I promise I'm not going to do anything. Yeah, eventually I think after a while he just decided that for now he basically had enough, and he was just going to lie down and have a rest. And so the males, even if the males themselves kill their food, they have to make sure they kill it and will eat it very quickly, because if they don't, it will come and be taken away from them by the females. And even the cubs that are of meat-eating age will have the right to eat before this adult male. So this is just showing, so these cubs, to all intents and purposes, are playing. And obviously, as we know, many animals throughout their life learn through play. So when you have lion cubs pouncing on mum's tail, or cheetahs stalking their mother, they're learning behaviors that will be useful to them in their adult life. What happens in this situation here is, yes, there is some play going on, but there's also some dominance behavior going on here. And as you can see quite clearly in this bottom picture, I think this one's got his brother or sister in a headlock, and doesn't look too excited about letting them go. So this was a different den. This wasn't a den site here where I'm based. This was actually in the Sabi Sands. And we sat watching this clan for a long time. And these youngsters, it never got to a point where it was overtly vicious, but there was definitely some nipping and, you know, sniping going around. And as I said, that's to establish dominance in this society means that you have the greatest chance of survival as an adult. The clans are made up of females and their female offspring. The males become nomadic at about 2 years of age, and they will then go and seek to find another group of hyenas that will allow them in to mate. So the females pretty much stay static with their sisters and aunts and so on, and then the males become become nomadic and join up with other clans. So in so doing, what this does is it means that you have a constant flow of new genes going through the system. So which is obviously what you want in terms of genetic diversity. So hyenas, in terms of their vocalizations, are quite remarkable creatures. They have at least 11 different vocalizations that we know of. The classic one is the one everybody who's been to Africa or has watched a documentary would have seen, where they basically whoop. It's that whoop that you'll often hear, and it's kind of a very, it's quite an eerie sound. A lot of people associate it with evenings in the bush, but that's only one of their calls. I've seen them when they get hyper excited or very nervous. They giggle, and it really does sound like a somewhat crazed giggle. They also have a growl that they will make in some form of aggression. But there are at least another 10 or so that have been identified. There was a lot of research done on spotted hyenas by a lady by the name of Dr. Kay Holkamp. And she did a lot of work in Tanzania and in the Serengeti, Kenya, studying hyenas over a very long period of time. I mean, I think her research project went on for something like 10 years. And in that period of time, she started to be able to differentiate between their communication patterns and what it was, you know, that they were indicating by the varying different sounds that they make. Spotted hyenas are not strictly nocturnal. You will often see them dawn and dusk, and they sometimes will be active during the day. The other species, the striped, the brown, and the aardwolf, are strictly nocturnal. So you pretty much have to be out at night to see them. But these guys, especially, what they sometimes will do is if they have a kill and they want to keep some of it, they'll actually cache it underwater. So they'll actually put part of a carcass underwater, and then I've also seen them out and about in the early morning. They'll come back to where they've cached it, and then they'll play around in the water for a period of time before they carry on with going back to their den and going to sleep for the day. They don't dig or make their own dens. What they will traditionally or usually do is take an aardvark burrow that has been vacated. It might have had other inhabitants, so it might have had warthogs in there for a period of time. And it has all these little underground chambers, and that is where the cubs stay. So they are kept, especially when the adults are out hunting, they will actually go down into these little tunnels. The adults themselves don't actually go down into the dens because the little passageways are too small, and that's really also an anti-predator behavior. It's to try and stop lions, for example, who actually are quite big bullies, to get in to try and kill their young. So just a little bit, I mean, I've alluded to this already, but related to their food and their feeding habits. I think this is probably the classic picture that everybody has in their mind of this is what hyenas do. There's a leopard up a tree who's killed something, and here's the hyena skulking around the bottom looking for scraps. And I think this is from where the picture, if you will, for not only Disney, but many people's perception of what hyenas actually are about. And this is a very small fraction of spotted hyena behavior. In truth, spotted hyenas actually kill about 90% of everything they eat. And they are extremely successful predators. Their their kill rate is about 30 to 35%. Now, whilst that might not sound a lot, if you compare it to between 5 to 15% for lions, you realize that they're actually very, very effective. And one of the reasons is they're what we call cursorial predators, so they run down their prey, and they can run for very long periods of time at quite high speed. And so what generally happens is that they will remove the weak and the sick from the population of whatever it is that they're preying on. So they also play a role in that way in keeping a population of prey animals healthy, because they're removing anyone that might be diseased. And their digestive enzymes are such that they can pretty much deal with anything. It seems that even anthrax, which obviously is a problem to many predators, spotted hyenas don't appear to even contract anthrax. So carcasses left lying around with anthrax spore, if they were eaten by anything else, those animals would contract anthrax, which is not something that you want happening. And so hyenas play a role in that. So this is just, I just want to show you, unfortunately, it's not, the comparison is not that easy to see, but I just want to show you what a hyena's kind of jaw looks like compared to something like a lion, a leopard, and then a poor cheetah. I say a poor cheetah because look at how tiny this head is. It's got a very, very thin skull. It's got no, we call these sagittal crests here, or zygomatic arches. And these are your cheekbones, really. But they are enormous in hyenas, spotted hyenas. And that's for the attachment of all the jaw muscles that give this animal such incredible crushing power in its jaw. There's a gentleman called Mitch Reardon who writes some very good books, and he wrote one called Shaping Kruger. And in that, he says he watched a lion for over an hour trying to bite through the shell of a terrapin or a snapping turtle. And this lion eventually gave up in disgust. Anyway, the hyena was around and it came along, and with one bite, it went straight through the carapace, and that was the end of said snapping turtle. So incredible crush power. What they will do is they utilize their different teeth for different purposes. And when they want to crush bone, they'll push it right to the back of their mouth, and then use their incredibly strong molars and premolars at the back with this jaw power to actually crush. So lions obviously have very big canines, but they don't have the crushing power of hyenas. They can gnaw on bones, but they're not going to crush bones to powder like hyenas can. And then leopards. Leopards are very strong creatures. They have incredible neck muscles, and that's because in areas where there are other predators, they will pull their kill up trees. And so they need that strength. But in terms of the ability to bite through bone and so on, that is not something that any of these predators, other than the spotted hyena, have the ability to do. So just before I go on to some misconceptions about spotted hyenas, there's some interesting interactions that also happen that perhaps we don't know about or wouldn't think about. So spotted hyenas, like most other carnivores in the bush, are territorial. And so they have territorial boundaries, so they will mark, they have the ability to anal paste. So a bit like something like a civet or a skunk would do. But they also mark with their feces, and when they pass their feces, it's essentially, they come out sort of a green color, and then almost immediately turn completely white. And that's because of all of the calcium and other minerals in the bones and things that they have crushed. Pretty much they can digest anything in their digestive tract except hair. They cannot digest hair. And unique amongst these bigger carnivores, they can actually regurgitate a fur ball. And they can, in that way, they will regurgitate any hair that they are unable to digest. But because their scat, as we call it, is so high in minerals, things like leopard tortoises, it's the strangest thing to witness. I've seen it a number of times, where tortoises will essentially come up and they will start chewing on hyena scat. And the reason they're doing that is they need those minerals for the maintenance of their shell. And that's the way in which they can get sufficient calcium, phosphorus, and various other elements that they need in order to maintain their shell. So all of these things, and that's one of the things about nature, are just so integrally linked. And then just a couple of misconceptions, as I call them, about spotted hyenas. So as far back as Aristotle, there was this myth that spotted hyenas are hermaphrodites, so that they have both male and female genitalia. It's a complete myth. They are either male or female, but the female genitalia have mimicked or do mimic a male's genitalia. And the reason for this is that they have incredibly high levels of testosterone, the highest amount of testosterone amongst any female, certainly within the any African animals. And that all comes back down to, in order to be dominant in the society, they have to have high levels of testosterone, which gives them the aggression that they require in order to remain the matriarchs. And it's a very bizarre structure, because the openings of both what would have been the vagina and the urethra have become fused into one. And this gives the females absolute control over mating, because not only is the structure quite difficult for mating to take place, but also if a female has been mated with by a male and she then decides that actually she doesn't really think that he was the right material for her cubs, she can literally, by urinating, flush all of those sperm out of her reproductive tract, and as a result, that's where that ends, and then she can start over again. So definitely not hermaphrodites. They just have this incredibly unique structure. It also makes birth very dangerous for them, and it's not infrequent because of the length of the birth canal, and also the fact that it has an incredibly sharp angle in it, means that there are quite high female and cub fatalities during the birth process. And also that they are stupid. So there's always this idea that the poor hyena is the really stupid idiot of the animal kingdom who kind of skulks around looking a bit sleazy, you know, not quite, definitely not the cool kid on the block. And what's interesting, and this came out of Kay Holkamp's work, is that they are incredibly intelligent, to the point where they share some of their capacity of intelligence with primates. So they are able to solve social problems. So, for example, they will, they have the means to recognize each other after long periods of time. They'll utilize distraction to pull other groups away. they've, in a group that Kay Holcamp worked with, she had puzzle boxes, and 14 out of the 16 hyenas that she tested were able to work out how to open this particular box. And so they learn from each other. So there is, within the society, they will be taught behaviors. And so to think that an animal like this could be classed as stupid, in my mind, is really not fair to them. So I think that they really are incredible animals. I don't expect you, so Dr. Gus Mills was a gentleman who did a huge amount of research on hyenas in the Kalahari. His work back in the 70s was some of the groundbreaking work on hyenas. And his niece was a colleague of mine. And Harriet said to me when they were growing up, whenever Gus came to visit them, the mantra had to be, hyenas are beautiful, hyenas are beautiful. So whilst I'm not expecting you to get to that, I hope that perhaps after this, you'll maybe just look at them in a little bit of a different light. I mean, look at those puppy dog eyes. So the last part of my talk is about the other creatures I think that most people have something of an aversion to, and that's vultures. And you might wonder what on earth I have kettles, communities, and wakes up there for. So these are interesting, I find them interesting collective nouns. So when vultures are in flight, they're called a kettle. When they're resting on ground or in trees, they're called a committee. And if you've ever watched vultures in a tree, I think perhaps that, sorry, it should say committee, not community, sorry. I think if any of you have ever watched a committee at work, there's always a lot of chatter going on, and vultures are no exception. And then when they're feeding, they're called a wake. And so, yeah, that's where the kettles, committees, should be the second word, and wakes comes from. So this chap perched up here, this photograph was actually taken on a NatHab trip in Monopools, one of the most beautiful places on earth. And this is a leopard-faced vulture. So within Africa, we have 8 species of vultures, many of which are now endangered due to habitat loss and also poisoning. So poachers who have, let's say, for example, poached a rhino, do not want vultures, which will be attracted to the kill, to give away the location of the carcass. And so what they do is they put down poison to actually poison them. And so as a result of this, a lot of our vulture species are endangered. So Charles Darwin didn't do them any favors. He called them disgusting, with bald heads, basically designed to wallow in putridity. Lovely old English. But again, I think it's showing one element of them, and I don't believe that we can really associate the word disgusting with them, and I'll explain why. So this is a white-backed vulture, so named because of its white feathers on its back. And this is a group of, so this is pretty much a committee of vultures. This picture was also taken on a NatHab trip in Hwangi Game Reserve in Zimbabwe. And there was an elephant carcass. So there was an elephant that had died of natural causes, probably by the drought. So when I was there, Zimbabwe was the height of a drought. And so there were many carcasses, many animals were dying of either thirst or starvation. And so sightings like this are not unusual in those situations. And whilst, sorry, I know it appears a little gory, but within minutes of there being a carcass like this, you will have hundreds of vultures that will come down. And their job essentially is to act as the sanitation department of the bush. And essentially what happens is the one here with the pink head, that's a leopard-faced. And this is the first vulture usually to arrive at a kill. And if it's not, the others still have to wait until the leopard-faced has done his job. Because look at the size of that beak compared to even something here like a white-backed. So these guys are the tin openers, if you will. So their incredibly powerful bills are able to break through bone and skin to actually open up the carcass. Once they've opened up the carcass, then everybody else can start to get in. And for example, some of these, the white-backed, have special adaptations. They have this long serrated tongue, which has almost like a groove in it. So they can actually put that into crevices and cavities where they can't get their bill to actually be able to pull out the food that they're looking for. So these chaps, these are just more whitebacks that were sitting on that same carcass. And then this is a typical interaction between these two being white-backed, and then this one being a hooded vulture. So hooded vultures are several orders of magnitude smaller. And if you have a look, it's got this incredibly narrow, thin bill or beak. And the reason for that is it's perfectly designed to be able to get in and get out the very last bits and pieces that are left behind. And what happened in this interaction was these white-backed had actually taken some meat from the carcass, which they were carrying away, and they dropped some. And then this hooded vulture took his opportunity and he was like, right, I'm in here. And I have no idea what he's eating, but it doesn't look too pleasant. But nonetheless, their role is to kind of clean up the last bits and pieces that are left behind. The other species of vulture, which is actually really endangered, it's just another one of these guys having a squabble. I'm going the wrong way. Oh, sorry. There we go. This is a juvenile white-headed vulture, and these are kind of in the same league, well, they're sort of between the white-backed and the hoodeds, but they are particularly endangered. Habitat loss has played a big part. One of the other things which I discussed in the last webinar, which applies to many vultures, is elephants knocking down big trees, and as a result of that, then there are no proper nesting platforms for them. So that's another thing that contributes to some of the challenges that these vultures face. And this is a picture just to show, this was also taken at Monopools, but this is the kind of situation that once the predators like the lions and everybody else has been in, and the jackals have come and they've scavenged bits, the hyenas have had their bit. This is what happens and what the carcass looks like eventually after the cleanup crew has finished. They will literally pick a carcass completely clean. So unbelievable in terms of being real sanitizing agents, because you can imagine extremely hot, 100 degrees, meat lying out in the middle of the open, how quickly that rots and breeds disease. And now you have animals that are able to come in and actually clear that up. So I guess the question is, how important are they really? And I think you probably already know my answer. So they're very important. And so you might ask, okay, well, why are they so important? So one of the things that they do is they contribute in nutrient recycling. So they increase the decomposition rate, and as a result of moving these pieces of meat, regurgitating, they essentially disperse nutrients through the soil. And a chain effect of this is it's able to provide nutrients into the soil to maintain biodiversity, which might not otherwise be able to be maintained. Yeah. So obligate scavenging vultures. So an obligate scavenging vulture essentially is one that has no alternative but to scavenge. So you will get some raptors, things like the bataleur, snake eagle, even tawny eagles. They will scavenge, but they're not obligate scavengers. They will kill their own food. So they are scavengers, but not obligate. But the ones that I've shown here, so things like this leopard-faced, the hooded, the white-faced, the white-backed, the acid in their stomachs can have a pH as low as 1, which is basically battery acid. And what's amazing about that is that this can not only dissolve food very rapidly, but it's also adequate to kill many, many pathogens. So again, they're able, things like the rabies virus, their stomach acid is actually able to break that, or to neutralize it, if you will. And in so doing, it then means that it's not passed on to other predators to whom it may well be dangerous. So it's another role that they play. It's not only in wild environments that they play a part. In some humanized areas, so where you have populations living in close proximity to areas where there are vultures, and throughout most of Africa now, vultures are restricted to protected areas. Outside of protected areas, they have a really hard time surviving. But you'll have situations like on the borders of the Kruger National Park or any of these parks really, where you have communities living. And very often those communities, there isn't the greatest organic waste disposal systems available to them, whether that be food or other other things. And essentially, if you have vultures, they will actually essentially remove it. And what that does is it stops other scavengers, which may be carrying diseases, things like rats, from coming into these areas to scavenge. And as a result, the vultures are now fulfilling that role, and they're not in and of themselves bringing in other diseases. So one of the things about vultures is they're actually incredibly clean. They are fastidious about grooming themselves. They very often go down to water to wash themselves after they have finished eating. If you have a look, they have pretty much no hair, no fur or feathers on their heads. I know this one's got something of a ruff down here. But if you think back to the ones who are going to stick their heads right inside the carcasses, they basically have virtually no feathers on their heads. And as a result of that, it means pretty much that you don't get all of this stuff from inside the carcass being stuck onto them, and as a result of that being a possibility to contract diseases. So in so doing, they're actually also able to help keep themselves clean. So I think just in terms of some very broad brushstrokes about hyenas and vultures. I hope that perhaps I've managed to give you an overview of what their role really is in nature, and how incredibly important both of them are in sustaining a healthy ecosystem, so that we can also see all the other animals that people perhaps more routinely want to see, and that they are just a vital part of healthy ecosystem functioning. So, thanks, Rob.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. Now, before we start the question and answer session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. With that, let's get to a couple of the questions. Now, we've all heard the term laughing hyena. Now, is that a species, or is that just a slang or colloquial term that is used?
So it's basically a colloquial term that is used to describe spotted hyenas, because they produce this. I won't even attempt to mimic it, but it really sounds like this crazy giggling sound, and that's where the term laughing hyena comes from. So it's actually a spotted hyena. The other hyenas have very they don't have no vocalizations, but their vocalizations are much more limited, and they don't have the kind of whooping, laughing that spotteds do.
Can you tell us how the population is doing for the spotted hyenas and other hyenas throughout the world?
So the population of spotted hyenas has remained fairly stable. Animals like striped hyenas, we don't actually have very accurate population numbers on them because they are so incredibly secretive, and so we don't really know how many of them. I don't even think we know exactly how many of them there are left. I do know that there is pressure on hyena populations when they come into conflict, in human conflict, animal conflict situations. So they really are quite dependent on protected areas, but they are not in the same jeopardy, if you will, as things like cheetahs or wild dogs. They are much, much more resilient creatures. So much so that one of the things that Kay Holtkamp said she found in her research, she started essentially saying that if you have hyenas in a population, then you've got a healthy ecosystem. Once hyenas start disappearing out of a reserve or an ecosystem, you've got a problem. Something is wrong, because hyenas can survive where many other animals can't. So I think it's fair to say that we have a stable population, especially of spotteds. Again, things like your aardwolf, you know, you see them so rarely that unless, and I haven't read any research papers on them, so I can't answer definitively. But I don't think that they're on any brink of being in trouble. I know spotted hyenas for certain are listed as IUCN category of least concern, which means that we have enough of a population to be genetically viable.
Well, that's terrific news. Can you tell us how a hyena's DNA, or how they compare to a cat or a dog, because they have some of the same traits?
Yes, so basically they do share some of the traits. So if you went back and you analyzed their DNA, you will find that they do share markers of DNA like we do with other primate species. They will share markers with dogs and cats. They're going to share more markers with cats or members of the cat family and also members of what we call the viverids. So viverids are things like your genets, and also things like herpestids, which are mongoose. So those animals share more genetic markers with them than dogs do. And that goes back to that common ancestor where they basically diverged from. And dogs came off basically earlier than the divergence that gave rise to hyenas and cat species. So there are, I do have a paper somewhere which basically looks at which markers are, which markers they have, which give them greater relatedness to certain species. If anybody's interested, they can let you know and I can forward them the paper. Because then, yeah, it'll give you an in-depth answer to that question.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, is there a season for the hyenas to procreate, and how long is the gestation period for a hyena?
So no, they're not seasonal breeders. So they can have pups or cubs at any time of year. And the gestation period is the same as for your domestic cat or dog. So basically just under 3 months. So yeah, they have a relatively, as all predators do, because it's very difficult for a pregnant female to hunt. They have relatively short gestation. But for their gestation period, interestingly, spotted hyenas are actually born really, they're born quite developed when you compare them to a lion cub, for example. I mean, lion cubs are utterly helpless when they're born. And these guys don't quite come out kicking and screaming, but it has been recorded that literally as one is born, as the second one is being born, the first one's already kind of fighting for dominance. So yeah, born pretty developed, and also to have teeth erupted and eyes open at birth is very, very unusual amongst any carnivore.
Do hyenas hunt in packs, or are they solo hunters?
So they are both. And this is where they are quite unique in that they are quite capable of hunting by themselves. And they've looked at scenarios in different parks, and where you have a relatively low number of ungulates, so things like, let's say, for example, zebras or wildebeest or whatever else they might look at hunting, they'll hunt solo. But where you start getting into areas where there are larger populations or migratory populations, they will then start hunting basically in a pack. And their way of hunting is, I think as I alluded to earlier, is literally to run their prey down. Very, very similar to wild dogs. They're built for distance, so that those very powerful front quarters and the sloping back, that is an anatomy, if you will, that is incredibly well adapted for being able to literally lope over incredibly long distances. So they can quite happily run, 9 or 10 kilometers, happily chasing something down, and still be able to kill it at the end of it.
Interesting. Now, what age does a hyena cub start to hunt, and would they hunt with their mother?
So basically, they'll start eating meat from about 8 months of age. And what's interesting is hyenas don't, like other predators, they don't bring food back to the den, and they don't regurgitate. They will come and collect their cubs and take them to the kill to feed. But really, they don't really start actively hunting until probably 18 months to 2 years. So in many ways, they're very developed, but in other ways, they're actually quite dependent, if you will, on the structure that supports them. And so it's one of the great tragedies is that when, I think it was Ernest Hemingway wrote in The Green Hills of Africa, he spoke about how many hyenas he'd killed. And sadly, the sad part of that is that if they had cubs, those cubs would all perish because no other female other than the mother will feed them because they don't allosuckle. And so, yes, they will learn in terms of hunting ability. They will actually be taught by other members of the clan. Part of their social structure is they will be taught how to hunt. That's how they learn.
Great. Well, thank you for that. But unfortunately, that's the last question that we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for any closing comments you may have.
No, just to say thank you very much. I hope that the people listening enjoyed it and learned something from it. And yeah, if anybody's got any questions, Rob, you're more than welcome to direct them to me by email, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lorraine, for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.